let's remove American exceptionalism and let's be honest for a second, right? We need to understand that what triggered our transition from the Articles of Confederation, which weren't working, 1777, to the United States Constitution, which was starting to be an idea in 1787. It was ratified 1788, and it was put into force in 1789, right? That was Shays' Rebellion. Please watch the video that I've attached or Google it because I don't want my ADHD to get off this point. But Shays' Rebellion is what triggered it, which is a fear of the people's power. That fear of the people's power is in the spirit of the Constitution, is in the spirit of originalist thinking. Yet, when we think of what created the Constitution and the text within itself, it is a document that protects the people's power, right? Why do you think that the majority conservative party has to go outside of the Constitution and to originalist thinking, which is the opinions and beliefs of those who wrote the legislation or wrote the Constitution or wrote the founding text, right? Why do you think they have to go outside of constitutional supremacy and into originalist thinking to get their actual justification, right? Because the Constitution is incomplete. So therefore, you cannot find all of the answers within the Constitution. You have to go to originalist thinking. Why? Because obviously it's not complete, the Constitution, right? And that creates an avenue in which you kind of have to look elsewhere. If we met those gaps, historically, then we wouldn't have to go outside the Constitution, right? But why is it that Amendment 10, which gives powers to the state and to the people, is the least litigated amendment when it comes to expanding on the power of the people? Because neither the federal or the state wants to expand on what the power of the people is, right? Because things like Shays' Rebellion, things like that, when we think of overthrowing a government, right? If the Constitution is supreme, then that should be a constitutional government, right? It should be, right? If that government is in obedience to the constitutional contract, right? When there is a crisis, the fact is that you should not be capable of overthrowing the constitutional republic. That is the whole thing. It's not a government, it is the constitutional republic. But presidents have deemed themselves as some sort of enforcer of their own agendas, right, above the Constitution. We see this throughout the parties because it's an inherited power, right? You start to move down on constitutional liberties like freedom of speech because you're hurting the feelings of ISRAEL, right? So what they see is the Constitution as an illusion to keep us behaving, right? While they do not respect it at the fundamental level because there is a lot of loopholes that can allow for manipulation that makes us feel powerless and makes them feel more powerful, right? So, what we have to consider is that one, we have to stop romanticizing the Constitution. Sure, that is our binding document, so I'm not over here saying to however, we have to understand that the reason that we are here is because so many have failed to actually clarify it because they deemed it as something that was sacred and shouldn't be changed, right? Or they were scared that the other side was going to change it. So now we're here with an incomplete constitution that literally the reason why we're in a crisis is because we voted in someone who was disqualified because they comforted and aided in an insurrection, which is forbidden through Amendment 14, Section 3, right? The disqualification clause. But since that is vague, and Scott has said, it has to be Congress who actually authorizes this, and Congress majority was MAGA, they said, we're not going to do this. So if the Constitution is supreme, then why do they have the option to not execute on a provision, right? That is the crisis. It is not anything that happened today. That is a furthering of the crisis, but the crisis happened when Democrats rejected to, at the bare minimum, even try to resist against the certification of someone who was disqualified for insurrection, right? Say, well, is he qualified? Is he not? Let's figure this out. But they said, well, we don't want to be like MAGA in 2021, so we're not going to say anything. And although that would have failed, right? I'm not delusional, that would have failed. It would have set precedent that there is a question of legitimacy, and that would have helped in what's happening now, because now what's happening is that institutions are saying, well, they have legal authority because it was a bipartisan certification, right? And there was no actual objections to it. So what we have to recognize is that the political government that exists today is done solely on the basis that the Constitution is so insufficient that they're capable of rewriting the constitutional rules, right? Because they're scared of the power of the people, and that is why they always hold the Insurrection Act against us, right? The Insurrection Act wasn't to protect the Constitution, it was to protect certain groups, right? Especially when it comes to the wealthy, right? Going against the government for taxation, right? Which is literally the inception of this country. However, taxation in itself isn't the problem. When we think of the problem that people have with taxation, it's that it's not a return of investment, right? That the country fucks the people in other ways to where taxation is a burden, right? So taxation itself is a constitutional duty, right? But when a constitutional crisis is that duty binding, right? So ultimately, we have to recognize that the reason why people are so angry at taxation is because the government has failed to actually properly invest that taxation. They send it abroad, they send it elsewhere that doesn't need it like the people do, but handouts for the people, right? They call it handouts, but we paid it into our taxation, right? Which means it's a return of investment. What's a handout is what we give to ISRAEL, right? But ultimately, we have to recognize that the Constitution is not something that needs to be romanticized because it does not do us justice when it comes to safeguarding us from what is happening today, right? So what we do with this information is something that will come up, but ultimately we have to recognize that if the Constitution was strong, we wouldn't be here. If the government was actually committed to the constitutional blueprint, we wouldn't be here. Because the Democrat lawmakers at the federal level see themselves not as fighters of the Constitution. They say we were voted in here to pass laws, right? We're not here to do anything else, which means they are doing bare minimum. And I'm not saying all of them. I am saying that them at the federal level say, well, I mean, you didn't vote for who you should vote for, so we're just going to sit on that and do nothing else, right? And that's where we're at, right? When it comes to the fact that all of these could have been prevented through strategic responses to what they've been doing, and instead they said, let's see how it goes, is a failure. Because at the forefront, they're more scared of people having power than a tyrant having power.